Hello everyone, please tell me. Which city are you listening from? What time is it there? It was a Thursday evening, and the city was quiet. The usual hum of traffic was faint, almost as if it were a distant memory, muffled by something I couldn't quite place. I was walking through the streets, heading home after a long day at work, my footsteps echoing against the pavement in the soft, cool air. The sky was clear, a deep, flawless blue, with not a cloud in sight. Yet, despite the beauty of the evening, something felt off. It wasn't a physical sensation. I didn't feel sick or dizzy. There was no tangible reason for the unease creeping up my spine. It was more like a quiet, nagging thought at the back of my mind, the kind that you can't quite shake off. The kind that tells you that something isn't right, even though everything around you seems perfectly normal. I stopped for a moment on the street corner, looking up at the sky, trying to make sense of it. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the buildings. The city was bathed in golden light, everything seemingly peaceful and serene. But that sound asterisk it was inescapable. It was the sound of rain. Not a storm, but a gentle rain, soft and steady. The kind of rain you hear against windows at night, the kind that lulls you into a peaceful sleep. It was subtle, at first. A light tapping, a soft patter, like raindrops falling on the pavement. But the more I listened, the more it became impossible to ignore. The thing was, the sky was clear. There was no rain, no clouds. The air was dry, and yet I could hear it, that constant, rhythmic sound of rain falling somewhere. It sounded as though it were all around me, filling the space between the buildings, bouncing off the concrete, splashing in puddles that didn't exist. I glanced around, my gaze shifting to the other pedestrians. They didn't seem to notice. They were walking briskly, heads down, lost in their own thoughts, unaware of the strange sound that filled the air. The city moved on around me, as it always did, but for some reason, I couldn't stop listening. I couldn't stop hearing it. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, my eyes scanning the streets. There were no signs of rain, no wet pavement, no puddles, no water dripping from the eaves of buildings. Everything was dry, as if the sound itself was the only evidence of the rain that wasn't there. I started walking again, my pace quickening slightly, trying to shake the strange feeling that had settled in my chest. But the sound didn't go away. It followed me, filling my ears, making everything feel just a little off. I could feel the sound in the back of my mind now, like it was a part of the city itself, something that wasn't quite right but was so deeply woven into the fabric of my surroundings that I couldn't escape it. I reached the intersection and paused, waiting for the light to change. A few cars passed by, their tires splashing through imaginary puddles, their headlights reflecting on the pavement that should have been wet but wasn't. The sound of the rain was still there, as clear as ever. And then, just as I was about to step off the curb, I heard something different, a whisper. It was soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. It came from somewhere behind me, from a darkened alley between two buildings. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned instinctively, but there was no one there. Just the empty alley, the shadows stretching long into the distance. The sound of the rain continued, but now there was something else beneath it. A faint murmur, like distant voices, speaking too softly for me to understand. I looked down the alley again, feeling a chill creep up my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me from the darkness. I crossed the street quickly, my eyes flicking nervously to every shadow, every corner. The sound of rain seemed louder now, more persistent, as if it were closing in on me, filling the space around me, making everything feel unreal, like I was walking through a world that didn't quite belong. I reached my apartment building and hurried inside, the door shutting behind me with a soft click. The sound of rain had followed me, even inside. It was still there, faint but ever present, like a whisper just on the edge of hearing. I stood in the lobby for a moment, listening, trying to make sense of it all. But the city was quiet now, the hum of traffic distant, and there was nothing outside to explain the rain that wasn't there. I took the elevator up to my floor and stepped out into the hallway. It was empty, as usual, the soft fluorescent lights flickering slightly overhead. But as I walked toward my door, I heard it again. That whisper, the faintest sound of voices, muffled and indistinct, as if they were coming from just behind the walls. My breath caught in my throat, and I stopped, standing perfectly still. The sound of rain filled the air around me, louder now, as though it was coming from every direction at once. But the whispers didn't stop. They were getting clearer, sharper, as if the walls were closing in, as though the city itself were trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand it. I reached for my door, fumbling for the key, my hand shaking. The whispering voices, mixed with the sound of rain, grew louder still, until it felt like the whole world was filled with it. The moment I stepped inside my apartment, the noise seemed to settle, but only for a moment. The soft pattering of rain on the window was still there, still so clear, but I couldn't explain it. I couldn't make sense of it. I locked the door behind me and sat down on the couch, my heart racing. The city outside seemed distant, quiet, as though it were far away, out of reach. But the sound, that soft, rhythmic rain, was still there, lingering in the background. And as I sat there, alone in the silence of my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The city outside was as it always was, empty, unremarkable, but something inside me had shifted. The rain, the voices, the strange sense that I was walking through a world that didn't make sense, it was all too much. I didn't know what it meant, but one thing was certain. The city didn't sound like it was supposed to. It sounded like rain, and I couldn't escape it. It was a late afternoon when I first noticed her, standing at the far end of the cafe where I always went after work. The soft hum of conversations and the clinking of cups filled the air, and the smell of freshly ground coffee mingled with the faint scent of rain outside. I was sitting at my usual table by the window, my gaze idly drifting out to the street, when she walked in. I didn't pay her much attention at first. She was just another woman, blending into the background of the cafe. But then, as she passed by, something about her stopped me cold. It was the smell. It wasn't the fragrance of any perfume, and it wasn't the kind of scent that lingered in the air like a fleeting memory. No, this smell, it was different. It felt like a memory itself, like the essence of something I had forgotten long ago. It was comforting, yet unsettling, the way a familiar song might sound after years of not hearing it. Or how the taste of a dish might hit you with a wave of nostalgia. It was the smell of a place I used to live, and yet I couldn't place it. Not at first. Not until my mind started searching for where I had encountered it before. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair, trying to focus on the warm cup of coffee in my hands, but the smell continued to tug at the back of my mind. It was the scent of wood, faint traces of cinnamon, and something else I couldn't quite identify. It reminded me of an old house, one I hadn't lived in for years, but whose memories lingered like ghosts in the corners of my thoughts. I glanced up and saw her sitting at a table by the wall, casually flipping through a book, her brown hair falling loosely around her shoulders. I couldn't stop looking at her, but not because of anything striking about her appearance. It was because of that smell. It was the same scent, the one that had once filled the rooms of my childhood home, the one I had breathed in every day for years before I moved away. The house where everything felt safe, where I could hear my mother's voice in the next room, and where the creaky floors and the worn-out furniture told the story of our family. But this woman, this stranger, couldn't possibly have any connection to that house. How could she? The years that had passed since I last lived there felt like a lifetime. Yet, as I stared at her, a strange sense of familiarity washed over me, like I should know her, like she had somehow stepped out of my past and into my present, though I had never seen her before. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked toward the counter to order another coffee, hoping it would calm the unease gnawing at my mind. But as I reached for my wallet, the woman looked up from her book and caught my gaze. For a moment, our eyes locked, and then she smiled. It was an effortless smile, warm and friendly, but there was something in her eyes that made me hesitate. She didn't look at me like a stranger. It was as though she recognized me, like we shared some unspoken connection, one that I couldn't understand. "Hey," she said, her voice soft, almost like she was speaking to an old friend. "I didn't expect to see you here." I blinked, stunned, unsure of how to respond. I didn't know her. I was certain of it. And yet, her words felt like a memory, like something I should have already known, something I should have recognized. "I'm sorry," I stammered. "Do I know you?" Her smile didn't fade. She set her book down on the table and leaned back in her chair, still looking at me with that same curious expression. "I thought you looked familiar. Have you been here before?" I shook my head, trying to brush off the sudden unease. "No, I come here often, but I don't think we've met." She didn't seem convinced, but instead of pressing, she nodded slightly and looked away for a moment, her gaze drifting back to her book. I could still smell it, the scent, the one that seemed so intricately tied to my past. The smell of my old home, my old life, but I couldn't figure out how she could smell like it. She didn't fit into that memory. She was a stranger. Yet, every time she moved, every time she shifted in her chair, it was as though the air around her held a piece of that place I had once lived. I didn't want to ask her anything more, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I was missing, something I couldn't quite grasp. The longer I stayed in the cafe, the more the feeling grew. It was like a thread pulling at me, trying to unravel something I didn't want to face. I finished my coffee, my mind racing, and stood up to leave. But as I walked toward the door, she spoke again, her voice catching me by surprise. "Are you sure you don't remember me?" she asked, her tones soft, but with a hint of sadness. I turned, my heart skipping a beat. Her eyes met mine once more, and for the briefest moment, something shifted between us. It was like a door creaked open inside me, and I saw a tan image of an old house, my childhood room, and the scent of cinnamon and wood filling the air. But just as quickly as the memory surfaced, it faded, leaving me confused and unsettled. "I'm sorry," I said again, my voice barely above a whisper. "I really don't." She nodded slowly, a flicker of something passing across her face recognition. Regret? I couldn't tell. But she didn't press any further. "You should come back sometime," she said with a soft smile. A smile that held both warmth and something else, something I couldn't define. I left the cafe in a daze, the door swinging shut behind me with a soft jingle. The cool evening air hit me, but the smell lingered, clinging to my clothes, following me out into the street. As I walked away, I tried to shake the unease that had settled in my chest, but it wouldn't leave me. That scent, that inexplicable familiarity, had haunted me long enough that I couldn't ignore it any longer. When I got home that night, I found myself sitting at the edge of my bed, staring at the walls that once held the memories of my childhood, and I realized something unsettling. It wasn't just the woman's scent that was familiar. It was her. She looked like someone I used to know, someone from my past, but I couldn't place her. It was like she was from a time I couldn't reach, from a life I thought I had left behind. And the worst part was, I still couldn't shake the feeling that she had known me long before I had ever seen her. I had never been one for the cinema. It wasn't that I disliked movies. It was just that I preferred to spend my free time elsewhere, doing anything but sitting in a dark theater for hours. But that evening was different. I had just finished a long day at work and was heading home, the cool evening air brushing against my face as I walked through the quiet streets of the city. As I passed the corner near the old cinema, I paused for a moment. I hadn't been down this street in weeks, but there it was, the cinema, standing like it always had, its neon lights flickering in the dusky twilight. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find modern blockbusters. It was more of a nostalgic relic, playing old films, classic ones that you'd forgotten existed until you stumbled upon the marquee. For some reason, I found myself drawn to it, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the curiosity of what film might be playing, or maybe I just needed a distraction. I stood outside for a moment, looking up at the large poster outside. But the names listed on the billboard weren't anything I recognized. The titles were odd, unfamiliar, yet the faces of the actors seemed vaguely familiar. It wasn't the kind of movie I would usually be interested in. Still, there was a pull, an odd sense that I should go inside. Something in my gut told me I needed to. So, without thinking much about it, I walked up the steps, pushed open the heavy wooden door, and stepped inside. The familiar scent of popcorn, old velvet seats, and stale air greeted me. The small lobby was dimly lit, and there was hardly anyone around. The attendant behind the counter was flipping through a book, barely looking up as I approached. "Single ticket for tonight's showing, please," I said, not entirely sure why I had decided to watch a movie. The attendant glanced at me briefly, almost as though he'd already expected me. Without a word, he printed the ticket, handed it to me, and gestured toward the theater entrance. I took the ticket and made my way to the darkened room. The theater was nearly empty, just a few scattered figures sitting in the back rows. I chose a seat closer to the front, settled in, and waited for the film to begin. The screen flickered to life with the familiar hiss of a projector. The sound was muffled at first, and the opening credits rolled by quickly, barely legible. But then, as the first scene unfolded, I froze. It was me. The camera was shaky, amateur, but unmistakably, there I was, standing in a room that looked just like the one I had grown up in. I could see myself, younger, perhaps by a few years, walking around my old house. The film was grainy, the lighting dim, but I recognized the couch, the old bookshelf with the novels I had never read, and even the family pictures hanging crookedly on the walls. I blinked, certain I was seeing things. I leaned forward, my heart pounding in my chest. How could this be? The footage was old, almost too old. It looked like something from the past, but the events playing on the screen were unmistakably real. It was my life, my past, but it was like someone had captured my memories on film. The scene changed, and now I was sitting at the dinner table, eating with my parents, laughing at something I didn't remember. The sound of my younger self's laughter echoed softly through the theater, and I could feel my breath catch in my throat. The memories were so vivid, so personal, yet I couldn't remember this moment at all. Had someone filmed me without my knowledge? How could they have known these small, intimate details? The next scene was even more jarring. It was a moment from a few years ago, one I had completely forgotten. There I was again, standing on the edge of a cliff, gazing out over the ocean. I had gone there alone, years ago, to clear my head after a difficult breakup. I had never spoken about it to anyone. Yet there I was, captured in perfect detail, a shot of me looking out at the horizon, my expression unreadable, the wind blowing through my hair. I looked around the theater, my mind spinning. No one else seemed to be reacting. The few people in the back were sitting motionless, staring blankly at the screen, as if they had seen this all before. I glanced up at the projection booth, but the window was dark, empty. The scenes kept changing, flickering by like old memories slipping through my fingers. I saw myself at various points in my life, moments I had long since forgotten, each one more intimate, more personal than the last. I watched myself walking through the streets of the city, passing by a cafe I frequented years ago, sitting at a bench by the lake, staring at my phone during a period of silence I had never spoken about. It was as if my life was playing out in front of me, but in a way I had never experienced it, like someone had captured all these moments, somehow, and compiled them into a film. A film that wasn't just about me, but seemed to hold all the parts of me that I had tried to forget. My emotions, my loneliness, the quiet corners of my life that no one else had ever seen. And then, just as the scenes began to spiral into memories I wasn't sure I wanted to relive. Something strange happened. The camera angle shifted. The scene on the screen blurred, and I saw something I hadn't expected. It was me again, but this time I wasn't alone. There was another figure standing beside me in the frame. It was hard to make out at first, but then the figure stepped forward into the light. It was a woman. I couldn't recognize her at first, but the more I stared, the more the face felt like it was familiar. She smiled at me from the screen, her face glowing with warmth. It was an intimate smile, a connection, like I had known her for years. And for a brief moment, I thought I recognized her, but the memory escaped me, slipping through my fingers like the rest. My heart began to race. Who was she? Why did she look so familiar, and yet so foreign at the same time? I could feel my hands shaking, the air in the room growing heavier. The movie kept playing, the scenes shifting more rapidly now. A blur of past and present, fragments of my life coming together into something that felt both personal and haunting. The woman remained by my side, watching me from the screen with that same knowing smile. Suddenly, the film stopped. The projector let out a soft click, and the screen went black. I sat there in silence, blinking, unsure of what I had just witnessed. The theater was still empty, the air still. I glanced around, but the only sound I could hear was my own breathing. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and stumbled toward the exit. As I walked out of the theater and back into the cool night air, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside me. I had seen things I wasn't supposed to see. I had witnessed pieces of my life, moments I hadn't remembered, and yet, now they felt real, like they had always been there, just waiting to be uncovered. I haven't gone back to that cinema since. I don't even know if it still exists, or if it ever did. But I'll never forget the look on that woman's face, or the sense of familiarity she carried with her. It's as though the past, the future, and the present have all become tangled together. And no matter how hard I try, I can't seem to untangle them. And every now and then, when I close my eyes, I see her again, smiling from the screen, as if waiting for me to remember something I've long since forgotten. I've never been the type to believe in things like fate or omens. I've always been the kind of person who needs to see things to believe them, who trusts logic over superstition. But that night changed everything. It had been a long day, one of those endless work days where everything seems to drag on, and you can't help but look at the clock, counting down the minutes until you can leave. I was tired, but I was glad to be heading home. The tram was almost empty, save for a few tired commuters scattered across the seats. The rain had started falling again, its gentle tapping against the tram windows blending with the hum of the vehicle as it rumbled through the city streets. The air inside was warm, the faint smell of coffee and wet clothes lingering in the stale atmosphere. I found my seat, as usual, near the window, leaning against the cool glass, my eyes staring absent-mindedly at the blurry world outside. The lights inside the tram flickered, as they often did in the older models, but it didn't bother me. I was used to it. The sound of the tram's wheels on the tracks became a comforting rhythm, almost hypnotic. I was lost in my thoughts, the fatigue from the day creeping over me, when I noticed something odd. The tram lights blinked again, but this time, it wasn't just a flicker. It was deliberate, like someone was trying to send a message, but I couldn't understand it. The lights blinked in a pattern, one that seemed to pulse in time with the movement of the tram. It was a strange, pattern, rhythmic, methodical, but not random. At first I thought it was just the flickering of the old lights, maybe a short circuit or a malfunction. But the more I looked, the more I realized that this wasn't just any flicker. The lights blinked again, a series of long and short flashes, timed perfectly, and it was then that I understood. They were blinking in Morse code. At first, I couldn't believe it. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was just seeing things. But the flashes continued, steady, precise, like someone was deliberately tapping out a message. I watched, my breath catching in my throat as I tried to make sense of it. It was unmistakable. Asterisk, don't return, 3 words, flashing in the dim light above me. My heart began to race. I looked around, half expecting someone to be watching me, someone who might be responsible for the strange message, but the tram was still mostly empty. Just a few passengers in their own little worlds, unaware of the blinking lights overhead. I looked back at the lights, my fingers gripping the seat in front of me. The message had been clear. My pulse quickened as I tried to rationalize it. Was it a prank? Was someone playing a joke, somehow manipulating the lights from somewhere? But how? The tram wasn't equipped with any technology like that. I had worked in tech long enough to know that the tram system was old, antiquated even. There was no way someone could hack into it, not unless... I shook the thought away. The idea was absurd. There was no reason to panic. But I couldn't ignore the feeling creeping up my spine. That sense of unease, the gnawing sensation that something wasn't right. I glanced at the other passengers again, but they were all engrossed in their phones, lost in their own worlds, oblivious to the strange phenomenon happening just above their heads. My gaze flicked back to the blinking lights. It blinked again. Asterisk, don't return, asterisk. The message was still there. It was like a warning, an eerie command, coming from somewhere I couldn't place. I glanced toward the door, my mind racing with questions. Why was it telling me this? Why now, on my usual tram ride home? My hands were clammy, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to get off the tram, to step outside into the rain and feel the cool air against my face. But there was something about the way the message had appeared that kept me rooted in place. I couldn't just leave. But then the tram reached my stop. I wasn't sure how long I had been staring at the blinking lights. I hadn't even realized that we had passed the usual landmarks, that we were near the stop where I was supposed to get off. My legs felt stiff, like they were made of lead, but I managed to get up from my seat. The door slid open with a soft whoosh, and the familiar sounds of the city outside flooded in. The rain was still falling steadily, the streets glistening with reflections from the streetlights. The tram had come to a stop, and the lights had stopped blinking. For a moment, I stood there, my hand on the pole, hesitant. I could leave. I could get off the tram, as I always did, walk home like I had every other night. But then that thought crept in again. The message, the warning, asterisk, don't return. I hesitated just a little too long, my mind battling with itself. Something felt off. Before I could make up my mind, the doors slid shut. The tram started moving again, its wheels clacking over the tracks. I looked at the door where I had been standing, almost as if expecting someone to be standing there, watching me. But there was no one, just the usual empty seats and the faint hum of the tram's motor. The lights blinked again. I stared up at them, dread crawling into my stomach. But this time, the message was different. Too late. The lights blinked out, as if they had never been there in the first place. The tram rolled on, the noise of the wheels on the tracks masking any other sound. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears now, loud and frantic, the panic rising in my chest. I needed to get off. I needed to leave. But it was too late. I don't remember how long it took me to get home. Everything after that was a blur. The tram ride, the walk back to my apartment, the sense of being watched. It was as if the entire world had tilted just slightly, as if I had walked into some twisted parallel where nothing made sense. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that something was closing in on me. The next day, I went to check the tram schedule, the usual route I always took. But there was something different. The tram number I had ridden the night before, it didn't exist. It wasn't listed on the schedule at all. It was as if that tram had never been part of the system. And then I remembered the message. Don't return. I've never taken that tram again. And every time I pass that stop, I feel that same feeling crawling up my spine, the same warning flashing in the back of my mind. It's been years now, but every time I see a tram, every time I hear that low hum of the tracks, I can't shake the thought. What would have happened if I had returned? It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind where the sky hung low and heavy, threatening rain that never came. I had finished a long meeting at work and found myself wandering the city streets aimlessly, my thoughts too cluttered to focus. I had always enjoyed walking in the quiet between the rush of traffic, the ebb and flow of people, but today it felt different. Something was off. A subtle unease in the air, but I couldn't quite place it. I was walking past the usual cafes, the small shops, and the corners I'd passed 1,000 times before when I noticed her. She was standing just outside a little bookstore, her back against the glass door, and for a moment, I almost didn't notice her at all. She was dressed in a simple gray coat, her dark hair tucked into a scarf. But there was something about the way she held herself, something that caught my eye. Her gaze was fixed on me, though I couldn't remember ever seeing her before. She wasn't staring in a way that felt intrusive. It was more like she was waiting for something, her attention drawn to me as if she already knew I would be there. I tried to ignore the growing sense of discomfort creeping up my spine. I smiled briefly, more out of politeness than any real recognition, and I kept walking. But she didn't move, and as I passed, I could feel her eyes follow me, steady and unblinking. Something about it felt too intense, too deliberate. And then, just as I was about to round the corner, she called out to me, "Excuse me." Her voice was soft, but it carried a gentle tug that seemed to pull at me. I turned around slowly, unsure of why I felt so uneasy. She smiled at me, but it wasn't the kind of smile that felt warm or inviting. There was something calculating behind it, something distant. She held up something in her hands, a photo, and for a moment, I thought it might be a misplaced flyer or a lost item she was trying to return. But when she extended it toward me, my blood ran cold. The photo in her hand was clear, crisp, and detailed. It was me, standing exactly where I was at that moment. The background was familiar: the bookstore behind her, the cobbled street, the small cafe a few steps ahead. I could even see the slight ripple of movement in the puddles on the ground from the earlier drizzle. But what made my heart skip was that I was standing there in the exact spot captured in time. In the photo, I was frozen in place, my body slightly turned as if I had just noticed her calling out to me, my expression unreadable but definitely me. It was impossible. I felt my chest tighten as I stepped closer, my gaze locked on the image. The photo was so real, so vivid, that for a moment, I wondered if it had somehow been taken seconds before, like some strange glitch in time. But I knew that wasn't possible. I hadn't seen a camera, hadn't noticed any movement in the air, nothing that would suggest someone had taken a picture. Yet, here it was. A photo of me standing in the exact same position, in the exact same place, only moments ago. "Where did you get this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, my hand trembling slightly as I reached out to take the photo, though I couldn't bring myself to touch it. The woman didn't immediately answer. She held it out to me again, her expression unreadable, before speaking in that same soft, steady voice. "I've been waiting for you." She said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. "This photo, it's yours. It was taken before you even walked past me." I didn't know what to say. My mind was spinning. It was impossible. There was no way she could have known where I'd be. No way she could have captured me in the exact place, at the exact moment. And yet, there I was, on the photo, staring back at myself. "Who are you?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. My heart was racing now, the air thick with an unease I couldn't shake. I stepped back, away from her, away from the image of myself that felt like it was growing larger in the photo, as though it had become a part of the moment, a part of the scene that was unfolding. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked at me for a long time, her gaze intense but somehow still calm. She didn't seem startled by my confusion, didn't seem anxious to explain herself. It was as though she had known this moment would happen, as though she had been waiting for me to ask the question. "Do you believe in fate?" she asked, finally. Her voice was low, as though she were telling me a secret. I didn't know how to answer. Fate. This wasn't fate. This was something else entirely. It felt wrong. It felt like I was standing in the middle of some twisted version of reality, where things didn't make sense, where time itself was broken. The fact that she had the photo, my photo, meant that she knew something I didn't. And then, just as quickly as it had started, she lowered the photo and smiled again, that same unsettling smile. "You'll understand soon enough," she said softly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. Then, without another word, she turned and disappeared into the bookstore, leaving me standing there, the photo still hanging in my mind. I didn't move for a long time. My mind was clouded with confusion, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of unease. It felt as though everything around me had shifted, like I was standing on the edge of something I didn't fully understand. It wasn't until later that I realized something strange. The photo I had seen, the one that had shown me standing in the exact place I was, had never made it into my hands. She had never handed it to me. I couldn't recall her ever actually offering it. I had only seen it, as if it had been pulled into my memory in that moment, as if it had been imprinted onto me. I reached for my phone to check the time, to try to ground myself, but when I unlocked the screen, the wallpaper froze me in place. It was a photo of me standing exactly where I had been earlier, outside that bookstore, at that exact moment. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't the same photo I had seen with the woman, but it was me, standing there, in that same spot. The thing was, I hadn't taken the picture. I found the key on an ordinary Tuesday, tucked inside a leather-bound book I had owned for years but never really read. It was an old book, one that had sat untouched on my shelf for months, maybe even years. I had inherited it from my grandfather, a thick, dusty volume with a faded gold emblem on the cover, its pages yellowed with age. I remember picking it up out of nostalgia, thinking I might finally get around to reading it, but as I opened the cover, something fell out. At first I thought it was just an old receipt or a forgotten bookmark, but when I picked it up, I realized it was a key. It was an old-fashioned thing, heavy in my hand, made of brass with intricate engravings. It was beautiful in a way that felt out of place, almost too ornate for something so simple. What struck me, though, was the small tag attached to the key with a string. There, engraved on the metal, was my name. Lucas, just my name, as clear as day. But I had never seen the key before. I had no recollection of receiving it, of finding it. And yet, there it was, tucked inside a book I hadn't opened in years. I stared at it for a long time, my mind racing. It felt like I should know what it was for, like it belonged to something important. But I couldn't remember ever losing a key, let alone finding one with my name on it. I shook the thought off. Maybe it was a coincidence, I told myself, or maybe it had just been something my grandfather had tucked in there for some reason, a detail lost to time. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. What was the key for? Why was it in that book? And, most importantly, why was my name on it? After a few moments of hesitation, I stood up and turned to my apartment. The thought of the key nagged at me, like a puzzle that needed solving, a thread I couldn't let go of. I needed answers. I needed to know what the key opened. The building I lived in was old, an early 20th century brick building that had been converted into apartments long before I moved in. It had narrow hallways and wooden doors, the kind of place that always creaked underfoot and smelled faintly of dust. There weren't many people around. Most of the tenants kept to themselves. My neighbors were quiet, and I liked it that way. I checked the door to my apartment. Nothing unusual there. Then I thought about the other doors in the building. There was the old storage closet at the end of the hall, which had always been locked. There were also the maintenance rooms, the ones with faded numbers painted on the doors, but none of them seemed to match the key in my hand. None of them had my name. But there was one door I hadn't thought of. A door I had never actually seen before, though I had walked past it hundreds of times. It was tucked away in the farthest corner of the hallway, almost hidden from view by the angle of the walls. I'd always assumed it was some kind of closet, or perhaps a janitor's room, but there had never been any reason to check. No one ever went there, and I certainly never thought to open it. But today, the key felt different in my hand, like it was urging me to try it, to see if it fits somewhere. I walked toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I had never really looked at it up close before. The door was old, weathered, its surface scarred with scratches and dents. The paint had chipped away in places, revealing wood beneath. A small brass plate was screwed into the doorframe, but it was so worn and faded that I could barely make out the number on it. It looked like a door that had been forgotten, left alone for years. My hand shook slightly as I slid the key into the lock. I didn't know what I expected to find behind it, but the click of the lock turning felt final, like something had been unlocked inside me as well. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the door, before I turned the handle and pushed it open. What I found on the other side took my breath away. It wasn't a closet or a maintenance room. It was a hallway. A narrow, dimly lit hallway that stretched out before me. The walls lined with old wallpaper that had long since begun to peel away. The air was musty, thick with the scent of dust and stale air, but what struck me most was the sense of familiarity. The hallway looked old, like something from another time, but I knew this place. I couldn't explain how, but every corner, every crack in the floorboards felt like something I had seen before. I stepped forward cautiously, my footsteps soft on the wooden floor. The hallway was quiet, almost too quiet, and the only sound was the distant hum of the building's old pipes. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, uneven shadows on the walls. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been here before. But I had never seen this hallway. I had never even known it existed. At the end of the hallway, there was a door. Unlike the others, it wasn't old or worn. It was new, the wood smooth and polished, the brass handle gleaming. It stood there, silent, waiting for me. The key in my hand felt heavier now, as though it were calling me forward, urging me to open it. I approached the door slowly, my breath shallow, my mind racing. The door looked so familiar, as if it belonged to a part of my life that I had long since forgotten. I didn't know why, but I felt an overwhelming urge to open it, to step through it, to find out what was on the other side. I slid the key into the lock, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I was making a mistake. But the door opened, and I stepped through. What I saw on the other side was not what I had expected. It wasn't a room, not in the way I had imagined. It was a mirror. A reflection of the hallway I had just walked through, only this time, everything was different. The walls were clean, the lights bright, and the floor was pristine, as if it had been freshly polished. The air was light, almost crisp, and the atmosphere felt peaceful, as though I had stepped into a place outside of time. And standing in the middle of the mirrored hallway, I saw myself, only it wasn't the me I knew. It was a version of me that I didn't recognize. Younger, more hopeful, with a smile on my face that seemed foreign now. I was standing in front of the door, just as I had been moments before, looking back at myself. I reached out, touching the glass, and the reflection did the same, mirroring my movements. But when I looked closely, I realized something that made my heart stop. There were no shadows in the reflection. No depth, no life. The version of me in the mirror was static, frozen in time, locked in place. I turned around quickly, and the hallway I had just walked through was gone. The door had disappeared, leaving only an empty wall behind it. I stood there for what felt like hours, the key still heavy in my hand, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I couldn't explain what I had just seen, what I had just walked into. But I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't alone. The hallway, the door, the reflection, they had all been waiting for me. I had been wandering through the city all afternoon, trying to clear my head, lost in the maze of streets that seemed familiar yet unfamiliar at the same time. It was one of those days where time doesn't seem to belong to you, a disjointed feeling, like I had stepped out of my own life for a brief moment, only to find myself somewhere strange. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, or even why I was still walking, but somehow, I ended up in a part of the city I hadn't seen before. The streets were narrow, lined with old, faded buildings that seemed to be holding on to their pasts. The air smelled of something unfamiliar, a mix of spices and dust, and there was an old-world charm to this part of town that felt both comforting and foreign. People walked by, lost in their own thoughts, their faces lined with years of stories that none of us would ever truly know. And then, as I turned a corner, I saw him. The street vendor was standing by an old cart, parked against the curb. At first glance, he looked like any other vendor in the city. An older man, his clothes worn and weathered, with a faint smile on his face. But there was something different about him, something that made me stop and take notice. His cart was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Instead of the usual trinkets or food, his cart was filled with small objects, old books, tarnished jewelry, and glass jars filled with something I couldn't quite make out. It was as if his cart had been pulled straight from the past, a patchwork of memories, moments, and forgotten things. As I approached, he looked up and met my eyes with a knowing smile. His eyes were dark, but there was something deep in them, something that made me feel like he had seen more than I could ever imagine. I was about to walk past, dismissing him as just another eccentric vendor, but then he spoke. "You look like you've lost something," he said, his voice soft but steady. I stopped. It wasn't just the words that caught my attention. It was the way he said them, as if he could see right through me. I didn't say anything at first, unsure of how to respond. How could he know that? How could anyone know that I was carrying a weight, an ache in the pit of my stomach, that I hadn't been able to shake for years? "I have something that might help," he continued, his voice coaxing, yet gentle. "Memories. I sell them." I stared at him, confused. Memories. What was he talking about? He noticed my hesitation and reached into the cart. With a slow, deliberate movement, he picked up a small, weathered object and held it out to me. It was a glass jar, its contents swirling in a way that made it seem alive. Inside, there was something shifting, almost like a fog. He pushed the jar closer to me, his gaze never leaving mine. It's a memory, he explained. Your memory, if you want it. I blinked. My memory. He nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. Yes, a specific one. All you need to do is choose. I've got plenty to offer. But this one is yours. It's something you've forgotten. Or perhaps something you've lost along the way. I didn't understand. I took a step back, my mind racing. It wasn't possible, right? There was no way a stranger could offer me something so personal. I had long since accepted that some memories fade, that some pieces of our past slip through the cracks and are lost to time. But this man, standing in front of me, seemed so certain. He was offering me a piece of myself. Why? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Why would you sell memories? The vendor shrugged, a small, almost sad smile curling at the corner of his lips. Some memories are meant to be kept. Others are meant to be passed on. I'm just the keeper of them for a while. I hesitated. My curiosity battled with doubt. What harm could there be? I had nothing to lose. I had long ago lost pieces of myself, and maybe, just maybe, this strange, eccentric vendor could give me something back that I didn't even know I was missing. What do I need to do? I asked, the words slipping from my lips before I could stop them. The vendor didn't answer immediately. He simply took the jar and twisted it open. As he did, the air around us shifted, the familiar sounds of the street, the chatter, the hum of traffic, the distant cries of children seemed to fade, replaced by an eerie silence. My gaze was fixed on the jar, and I could feel something stirring within me, something pulling at the deepest parts of my memory. Just take a look, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I leaned in, my breath catching in my throat. The swirling mist inside the jar began to take shape, coalescing into something recognizable. At first, I couldn't quite place it. But then, it hit me. It was a memory. My memory. I saw myself, a younger version of me, standing in the kitchen of my childhood home. I could hear my mother's laughter in the background, the warmth of the sunlight streaming through the window, and the smell of fresh bread baking in the oven. It was a memory I hadn't thought about in years, a moment of such simple happiness that I had completely forgotten. My mother, her face radiant with joy, had called me over, and I could see myself running to her, arms outstretched. The memory was so vivid, so real, that I could almost feel the warmth of that moment again. It was as if I had been transported back in time, back to a place I had lost, to a version of myself that seemed so distant now. I could almost hear my mother's voice calling me. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the memory began to fade. The mist inside the jar swirled again, and the image of my younger self dissolved, leaving nothing but the faintest trace of warmth in its wake. I gasped, pulling back from the jar, my heart pounding in my chest. It was too real. It felt like I had just relived a piece of my past, like I had been transported back to a time when things were simpler, before the weight of the world had started to change me. The vendor was watching me closely, his eyes filled with understanding. It's yours now, he said softly, his voice almost a comfort. You can keep it, or you can let it go. That's the way memories work. They can be with you forever, or they can slip away, forgotten once more. I didn't know what to say. The memory had been so real, so tangible, that I felt a part of me was still stuck in it. I could feel the warmth of my mother's presence, hear the laughter, smell the bread baking in the oven. It was too much, too overwhelming. I looked at the vendor, unsure of what to do with this gift, this piece of myself that he had given back to me. "How much?" I asked, my voice shaky. The vendor smiled, his eyes soft, with the kind of understanding that only comes with time. "The price is different for everyone. Some things are free. Others, you can never truly pay for." I didn't ask him again. Instead, I stood there for a long moment, contemplating the jar in my hands, the memory swirling within it, waiting for me to make a choice. In the end, I didn't take it with me. I didn't need to. The memory was mine already, locked inside me, like it always had been. I thanked the vendor and left, the streets around me once again filling with the usual sounds of life. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just experienced something impossible, something I would never fully understand. Maybe some memories are meant to be passed on. Or maybe some memories find their way back to you when you least expect it. The rain had been falling steadily all day, and by the time evening came, the fog had begun to creep in. The city streets were slick with moisture, and the lights from passing cars reflected off the wet pavement, creating a ghostly glow. I had just finished a late shift at work, the kind of night that leaves you exhausted but restless, needing something to take your mind off the day. I decided to stop by a small cafe I'd passed 100 times but never bothered to go into. It was one of those quiet, tucked-away places, the kind where time seemed to slow down the moment you stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of coffee and old wood, and the soft murmur of conversations filled the room. I grabbed a corner seat by the window, pulled my coat tighter around me, and settled in with a hot drink to unwind. The cafe wasn't crowded, and most of the patrons seemed absorbed in their own thoughts or conversations. The window beside me was fogged over, the condensation thick enough to distort the view outside. I liked it that way, the way the outside world blurred into abstract shapes and shadows, leaving me with nothing but the warmth of the cafe and my own thoughts. I took a deep sip of my coffee and let out a long sigh, the warmth spreading through me. That was when I noticed her. She was sitting at the table across the room, near the door, but I hadn't noticed her come in. Her figure was silhouetted against the dim light, her face hidden in the shadows. She was looking down at something in her hands, a piece of paper, maybe a book. I couldn't tell from where I was sitting, but there was something about her presence that caught my attention. She seemed still, not in the peaceful, contented way, but in a way that felt almost unnatural, like she wasn't quite part of the room. I tried to shake off the feeling and turned back to my coffee, but there was something about the air around her that made it hard to concentrate. It felt like the room had become quieter, as if everything had shifted slightly, just enough for me to notice. The hum of the coffee machine, the clink of cups, everything seemed to fade, and all I could hear was the soft ticking of the clock above the counter. And then I saw her move. She stood up suddenly, almost too quickly, and I felt a brief sense of unease as she walked toward the window. She didn't look at anyone as she passed, her eyes fixed straight ahead. I watched her approach the fogged-up glass, and for some reason, I couldn't look away. She stood there for a moment, pressing her fingertips against the cold window, as though testing the temperature. And then she began to write. Slowly, deliberately, she traced something into the condensation, a name, I thought at first. But as the fog clouded back over the surface, I realized it wasn't just a name. It was an address. My address? I froze. The room seemed to tilt just slightly, the edges of my vision narrowing. I blinked, trying to convince myself that I hadn't seen what I thought I saw. But there it was, clear as day. My address, written in a delicate script, as though she had known it for years. Before I could make sense of it, she wiped it away. One swift motion of her hand, and the condensation cleared, the glass returning to its usual foggy state. There was no trace left of what she had written, no evidence that the address had ever been there at all. My breath caught in my throat as I glanced around the room. No one else seemed to have noticed, their attention still focused on their own quiet corners of the cafe. I looked back at her, my heart pounding, but she was already sitting back down, her face still obscured in the shadows. I couldn't see her expression, but I felt her gaze settle on me, a weight on the back of my neck. The air seemed to thicken around me, as though the space between us had grown too small. I couldn't move, couldn't think clearly. I wanted to get up, to leave, but my body wouldn't obey. Instead, I found myself staring at the window where the address had been, staring at the spot where her fingers had been just moments before. The fog was returning, slowly, as the warmth from the inside of the cafe met the coldness outside. It began to cloud the glass again, and I watched, transfixed, as shapes started to form, but this time, nothing was written. I couldn't bring myself to look at her again. Something about the way she had erased it so quickly, as though it had never happened, unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. My mind screamed that it had to be some kind of mistake, some trick of my tired brain. But I knew what I had seen. I had seen my address, written in a place I had never expected, by someone I didn't know. I quickly paid for my drink, my hands trembling as I fumbled with my wallet. I couldn't stay there. I had to leave. I made my way toward the door, glancing back once more before I stepped outside. She was still sitting there, the shadows cloaking her face, her presence like a dark ripple in the calm of the cafe. As I stepped out into the cold air, the chill of the evening settling into my bones, I tried to push the thought of her from my mind. I forced myself to focus on the sounds of the city, the steady rhythm of my footsteps as I walked home. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching me, that her gaze was following me through the fog, even though I couldn't see her anymore. And every time I passed a fogged-up window, I felt it. That chill creeping up my spine. The memory of the address, written in the condensation, wiped away as though it had never been there. But I knew it had been, and I couldn't forget it. The evening air had a slight chill to it, but it wasn't cold enough to make you uncomfortable. It was one of those strange moments where the day's warmth lingered in the shadows, giving way to the soft calm of night. I had been walking home after a long day, the sounds of the city muffled by the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. My footsteps were slow, my mind wandering aimlessly as I took the usual path through the park. It was a route I'd taken countless times, a shortcut to get home, nothing special. But that night was different. As I passed by the tall iron gates that marked the entrance to the playground, I heard something. It was faint at first, like a distant echo, something you might write off as a trick of the wind or an illusion. But then it came again, the unmistakable sound of a child's laughter, light and carefree, echoing through the quiet park. I stopped, uncertain for a moment. The sound of children laughing had become almost foreign to me in recent years. The park, though usually lively during the day, was eerily still now, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. There was no one in sight. No children running around, no parents pushing swings. Just silence and the faint, distant laugh that tugged at me. At first, I told myself I must have imagined it. It was late, and I was tired. Maybe it was just the remnants of a memory playing tricks on my mind. But then it came again, clearer this time. The laughter sounded as though it was coming from just beyond the playground, like a child running in circles, full of joy and energy. Something about the sound made my chest tighten, an uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. It was such a pure, innocent sound, and yet it felt wrong. It felt out of place in the stillness of the park at this hour. Against my better judgment, I found myself walking toward the playground, drawn by the laughter, even as a part of me screamed to turn around, to leave. I reached the entrance, passing through the rusty gates, their hinges creaking faintly in the breeze. The playground lay ahead, the swings, the slides, the jungle gym all silent, unmoving. The laughter had stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence that seemed to deepen the further I stepped inside. I looked around, my breath catching in my throat. There was no one there. No child, no parent. Just the playground, its usual bright colors now muted by the dim light of the street lamps. I walked further in, my feet dragging through the soft sand underfoot. The empty swings creaked gently, moving with the wind, but there was no child to be seen. No one playing, no sign of life. And then, just as I was about to turn and leave, I heard it again. The laughter. Closer this time, so much closer. It echoed, bouncing off the metal frames of the playground equipment. It was no longer distant, no longer fading into the background. It was right there, right next to me. My heart began to race, my instincts screaming that something was wrong. I turned quickly, looking over my shoulder, but there was nothing. Nothing except the empty, dark corners of the playground. The laughter had stopped, but its presence lingered like a weight in the air. I felt it pressing down on me, filling the space with an unease that made my skin prickle. I turned in a circle, my eyes scanning the empty swings, the jungle gym, the seesaw, all eerily still. The laughter had stopped, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. I was not alone, I knew that much. But I couldn't tell from where or what. There was something else in that playground, something unseen. I could almost feel it, hovering just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting. And then, as if responding to my panic, the laughter came again, this time closer than ever. It was high-pitched, sharp, and full of delight, but it was also cold, unsettling. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this moment, in this place. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was still nothing. The swings moved ever so slightly in the wind, but everything else remained still. I could hear the laughter again, but now it wasn't just one child. It was many, all laughing in unison, a chorus of shrill, eerie giggles that seemed to come from all directions. My heart raced in my chest, my pulse pounding in my ears. I felt my legs stiffen, frozen in place, as if the laughter was seeping into my bones, freezing me where I stood. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn and flee from the playground, from the sound that was becoming all too real. But I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were glued to the ground, the weight of the laughter anchoring me in place. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the laughter stopped. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. I stood there, breathing heavily, my mind racing. I couldn't explain what was happening. The park was still, as it always was at night. There was no sign of anyone, not a child, not a parent, not a figure hiding in the shadows. And yet, I felt as if I had crossed a line, as if I had ventured into something I was never meant to see. I forced myself to turn around, my body stiff and tense. I walked quickly, almost stumbling, as I made my way back to the gate. But as I reached the exit, I heard one final thing, a soft voice, barely audible, whispering through the night. "Come play with us." The words hung in the air, and for a split second, I could have sworn I felt something brush against my shoulder, as though a hand had just grazed me. But when I turned around, there was nothing. Nothing except the empty playground, waiting in the darkness. I didn't look back as I left, my pace quickening as I made my way out of the park and back to the safety of the streetlights. The echo of that laughter still lingered in my ears, fading slowly as I walked further away. But I knew, deep down, that whatever it was that had called me there wasn't finished. It had seen me, heard me, and now it was waiting for me to come back. And somehow, in the back of my mind, I knew that the next time I passed by that playground, I wouldn't be able to resist. The laughter would draw me in again, because it always does. It was late in the evening, the kind of time when the world feels just a little too quiet. When the city's bustle slows to a hum and everything seems to be resting in a quiet lull. I was walking home after a long day, my footsteps echoing against the pavement as I navigated through the narrow, dimly lit streets. The air was cool, the hint of an autumn chill settling in, but nothing that would be considered cold. Just the kind of evening where you pull your jacket a little tighter and breathe in the crisp air. I didn't plan to take this particular route home. I usually avoided the alleyways. They always felt too close, too dark, but for some reason, tonight, I found myself walking down one. Maybe it was the need to shorten the walk, or maybe it was just the way my feet moved without asking for permission. I don't really remember deciding to walk through the alley. I simply found myself there. The alley was narrow and lined with old brick walls, the kind that had been worn smooth from years of wind and rain. The air was heavier here, filled with the scent of damp earth and rust, but it wasn't unpleasant. The city smelled this way in places where life was less visible. where the sidewalks were cracked and the streetlights barely flickered on. I could hear the faint hum of traffic from a distance. But here, it felt isolated, like the world had paused for a moment just for me. And then, as I walked deeper into the alley, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic, nothing that would make anyone else stop or even raise an eyebrow. But I felt it. A subtle shift in the air, something I couldn't quite explain. And I paused for a moment, the faintest flicker of unease crawling up my spine. I didn't know why, but I inhaled deeply, and that's when I smelled it. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the more I breathed in, the more the scent filled my senses. It was faint, but unmistakable, the distinct smell of old wood, a hint of lavender, and something that I couldn't place, something sweet and comforting. It was the scent of my grandmother's house. I don't know how else to describe it, but in that moment, I was certain of it. It was as though the very air had transformed, pulling me back in time to her kitchen. To the old furniture that had been polished for decades, to the soft, cozy smell of the rooms I hadn't stepped foot in for years. I stopped in my tracks, my heart suddenly thudding in my chest. My grandmother had passed away 5 years ago, and I hadn't been back to her house since the funeral. The idea of her house, the place I spent so many summers as a child, where I'd play cards with her, where she'd tell me stories and make her famous apple pie. It had been a place of love and warmth. But the scent of it, that specific combination of smells, was something I hadn't even thought about in years. And yet, here it was, in this alley, of all places. I stood frozen, my feet unmoving, the smell surrounding me, curling into my lungs, filling me with an odd mixture of comfort and dread. It was as though she were there, with me, in that moment, in the shadows of the alley, even though I knew she couldn't be. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to leave, but my feet remained planted to the ground, rooted by some invisible force. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breath, but the scent only grew stronger, more overpowering. It felt as if I was trapped in a memory, surrounded by the warmth of something that was gone, something I could never go back to. The hairs on my neck stood up as I listened closely to the faint sounds of the alley. But all I could hear were the distant echoes of my own breath, the low hum of the city far away. There were no footsteps, no voices, nothing but the smell and the strange pull in the air that made me feel as though I wasn't alone. I began to walk again, cautiously, my eyes scanning the dim shadows as I moved further down the alley. The smell followed me, like a shadow, persistent and inescapable. Every step felt heavier, as though the weight of the air was pressing down on me. I turned a corner, hoping that the smell would dissipate, hoping that I could outrun whatever this strange sensation was, but it only seemed to grow stronger. I had to know what was happening. I paused in the middle of the alley, unsure of what to do next. My chest tightened, and my hands trembled slightly, but I couldn't explain why. It was as though I were standing on the edge of something, a line between the present and the past, something that shouldn't exist but did, like a secret door that had opened without my permission. That's when I heard it. A soft sound, just behind me, like the shuffle of old slippers on a wooden floor. The kind of sound that made you think of someone quietly moving from room to room. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing. No one. Just the empty alley, the old brick walls, the damp pavement beneath my feet. But the smell, it was stronger now, almost suffocating, filling my nostrils. And that was when I realized the truth, the thing that had been gnawing at the edge of my consciousness. The smell was not just the scent of my grandmother's house. No, it was her. It was her presence, like a ghost woven into the fabric of the air itself, as if she had somehow left a piece of herself behind, lingering in the space I stood in. The sensation was overwhelming, a strange mix of love and loss, comfort and sorrow. I wasn't alone. I could almost feel her there, in the space just beyond my reach, as if she were standing in the shadows, watching me, waiting. My mind screamed for me to leave, to run, but my feet remained stuck. I could almost hear her voice in my head, soft and distant, like it was coming from the farthest corner of my memory. "Don't be afraid," the voice whispered, just out of reach. I spun again, the alley now completely still, the shadows deeper, darker. My heart pounded in my chest, the weight of the air suffocating me. But when I turned back to look, there was nothing. Just the alley, as quiet and empty as it had been when I first walked in. The scent of lavender and old wood began to fade, replaced by the damp, cold air of the night. I took a deep breath, shaking my head. It was ridiculous, I told myself. Just a trick of the mind, a momentary lapse. I was imagining things. But as I walked away, the last remnants of that comforting scent hung in the air. A reminder of a place and a person I would never see again. And though the smell gradually faded with every step I took, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had never really left that part of my grandmother. Part of her essence was still lingering in that alley, still waiting, even after all these years. It wasn't just a memory. It was something else. Something I couldn't explain. And I wasn't sure if I ever wanted to understand it. It was a mild afternoon when I decided to take a walk in the park. The kind of day where the sun pokes through the clouds just enough to make everything feel a little warmer than it really is. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the air was thick with the scent of damp grass. I had no particular reason for being there. It was just one of those days when my mind needed a quiet space to settle, away from the constant hum of life. The park was a familiar escape, a place I visited often when I wanted to clear my head. The path I walked was lined with benches, some occupied by people reading, others simply enjoying the stillness. Birds fluttered around, and the distant sound of children's laughter echoed through the trees. I wandered along the gravel path, my thoughts drifting, until I came across her. She was sitting on a bench, just ahead, in a spot under a large oak tree. Her posture was straight, yet relaxed, as though she were completely at peace with the world. She seemed so ordinary at first glance, just another person passing through the park, maybe waiting for someone or simply enjoying the afternoon. But there was something about her that caught my attention. Her clothes were simple, a loose white dress that billowed slightly in the breeze, but it was the way she sat that made me pause. Her feet weren't touching the ground. At first I thought I was imagining things. The park was filled with people, and the shadows of the trees sometimes played tricks on the eyes. But as I drew closer, I could see her more clearly. She wasn't sitting on the bench like the others. Her feet hung just a few inches above the ground, as if suspended by an invisible force. She didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't mind. Her gaze was fixed ahead, unfocused, like she was looking at something only she could see. I stopped walking, suddenly self-conscious, unsure whether I should approach or turn away. There was something strange, unsettling even, about her stillness. She didn't move, didn't fidget like most people do when they're waiting. She simply sat, her feet dangling above the ground, her dress gently fluttering in the breeze. A part of me wanted to turn and leave, to pretend I hadn't seen her. But another part, a curiosity that seemed to awaken within me, urged me to keep walking. I continued down the path, closer now, my footsteps soft on the gravel. As I passed, I could feel her presence more acutely, like something in the air had shifted. Her stillness was almost palpable, and the soft rustling of leaves above us seemed to grow louder, more pronounced. It was as if the entire park had become quieter, like everything around us had slowed to accommodate her strange presence. The birds, once chirping merrily, seemed to have fallen silent, and the rustle of the trees no longer carried the usual gentle rhythm of wind through branches. Even the children's laughter had faded into the background, replaced by an almost oppressive silence. I glanced over at her again, just as I was about to move past. Her face was pale, her features soft and serene, but her eyes were unsettling. They weren't looking at anything in particular. It was as though they were seeing something far beyond the park, something that didn't belong in this world. I felt an instinctual shiver run down my spine. She wasn't quite right, but I couldn't put my finger on why. I was just about to continue walking when, for reasons I couldn't explain, I stopped. My curiosity tugged at me, pulling me back. I turned and took a few tentative steps toward her, unsure of why I felt this sudden need to approach her. When I was only a few feet away, I realized that the park, which had been so full of life before, had become eerily still around her. It wasn't that it was silent. No, it was deeper than that. The world seemed suspended in time, frozen in place, and for the first time, I felt a weight in the air, something heavy, like the very fabric of reality was holding its breath. I looked at her again, her feet still hanging above the ground. She didn't seem to be aware of me at all. She was too lost in whatever was before her, whatever she saw in that world of her own. The longer I stared, the more I felt like I was intruding on something sacred. Like I had crossed some invisible boundary just by walking too close. But still, I couldn't look away. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I was close enough now to speak to her, to ask if she was okay, if she needed help. But just as I opened my mouth to say something strange happened. The air around us seemed to hum, like the very atmosphere had started vibrating. A faint shimmer, like heat rising off the pavement on a summer day, flickered around her figure, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something behind her eyes. A glimmer, a flicker of recognition, as though she had finally noticed me standing there. But it wasn't fear. No, it was something much more unsettling. It was as though she had known I would come, as if she had been waiting for me. And then, without a word, she slowly looked over at me. Her expression didn't change, but the intensity of her gaze made my heart skip a beat. It felt as though she was seeing something deep inside me, something I hadn't even known was there. Before I could react, before I could even understand what was happening, the corner of her mouth lifted in a slow, knowing smile. It wasn't a kind smile, nor a malicious one. It was something else entirely. A smile that said she knew more than I could ever comprehend. And just like that, the world seemed to shift again. The trees rustled back to life, the birds resumed their calls, and the park returned to its natural rhythm, as if nothing had ever happened. I blinked, and she was gone. The bench was empty now. Her feet, which had once hung just above the ground, were no longer there. There was no trace of her, no sign she had ever existed, other than the faint, lingering chill in the air. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. Had I imagined it? Had I fallen asleep on the path, lost in some strange dream? I didn't know. I couldn't know. All I knew was that something had happened, something I couldn't explain, and it left a mark on me, an invisible weight I couldn't shake, as if I had brushed up against something not meant for this world. I turned and walked away, my thoughts clouded, the memory of her lingering in my mind. I never went back to that park, and I never saw her again. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, when I'm alone with my thoughts, I wonder if she was waiting for someone else. Or maybe she's still there, in the park, sitting on that bench, waiting for the next person to stumble across her. And when they do, I wonder if they'll feel it too, that strange, unsettling presence, the knowledge that they are not the ones in control. Maybe she's still waiting. It was one of those nights where everything felt slightly off, the kind of quiet evening that unsettles the mind, when even the sound of raindrops against windows seems too loud. The air was heavy with the weight of the storm, the kind of rain that falls without mercy, soaking everything in its path. I had just finished a long day at work, and all I wanted was to get home, curl up in bed, and escape into a book. But the buses in this part of town weren't as frequent after dark. And as I arrived at the bus stop, I saw the last bus of the night pulling away in the distance. It wasn't that big of a deal. I had waited before, and another one would come soon enough. Or so I thought. The minutes dragged on, longer than I expected. The streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the wet pavement, and the usual buzz of city life was muted under the storm. It was only after what felt like an eternity that the bus finally appeared. It pulled into the stop with a creak, its headlights cutting through the rain-soaked night. I didn't even think twice. I climbed on, paying my fare without a word, my mind focused on the warmth of home. The bus was mostly empty, save for a few souls scattered across the seats. People who, like me, seemed eager to reach their destinations, though none of them looked particularly awake. I found a seat by the window, the cool glass offering a brief, fleeting comfort as I sank into it. I didn't usually take the late bus, and there was something odd about the silence on board, something heavier than the usual hum of a tired crowd. Even the sound of the rain outside seemed to soften once the doors closed behind me. I let my eyes wander for a moment, glancing at the passengers around me. The bus was dimly lit, the overhead lights flickering occasionally as though struggling to stay on. But then, I began to notice something strange. People weren't looking out the windows or into their phones like they usually would. They were staring at me. Not in the way you might expect, a casual glance or even an interested look. No, their eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. But it wasn't just their stares that unsettled me. It was the whispering. At first, it was so soft I thought I was imagining it. Just the usual hum of conversation you might hear on a bus. But then, I started to catch words. My name, my childhood nickname, my favorite food. Private details that no one should have known, details that only a few close people in my life would be able to speak. I couldn't make out everything, but the snippets were clear enough. She's always so quiet when she's nervous. It's her secret. Always hiding things. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself it was nothing more than my tired mind playing tricks on me. But the whispers grew louder, closer, more distinct. Each passenger's voice seemed to melt into the next, creating a distorted chorus of voices that felt impossibly connected to me, as if they knew things I hadn't shared with anyone. The words they whispered weren't just about me, they were about moments I had forgotten, moments I had buried in the corners of my memory. The first time I'd lied to my best friend. A secret argument I'd had with my mother years ago. A fear I hadn't spoken aloud in ages. My heart began to race, and I could feel a cold sweat prickling the back of my neck. I turned my head to look at the passengers, but no one was looking directly at me anymore. Instead, they stared at their laps, at the floor, or out the window. Their faces now shrouded in shadows from the rain-soaked glass. I wondered if maybe I was just imagining the voices, but when I looked at each person's face, I could see the subtle movement of their lips, as if they were speaking my secrets without ever uttering a word. The whispers were real, undeniable, and they seemed to be growing more specific, more personal with every passing second. I tried to focus on something else, anything else. The rhythmic thrum of the bus's wheels on the wet pavement, the swish of the windshield wipers, the soft hum of the engine. But the voices followed me, clinging to my thoughts, seeping into my mind like cold water. I looked at my hands, clasped tightly in my lap, trying to steady my breathing. I had to get off the bus, I thought. I couldn't stay here, surrounded by these people who somehow knew everything about me. But no matter how much I told myself to get up, my legs felt heavy, like I was rooted to the seat. Then, as if by instinct, my eyes shifted to the front of the bus. The driver's rearview mirror caught my gaze, and for a moment, I saw him, or I thought I did. The reflection in the mirror wasn't of the bus driver at all. It was of someone else. Someone who looked remarkably like me, though older, with weary eyes and a sad, knowing smile. It felt like a cruel joke, the kind where the punchline only becomes clear at the very end. The reflection stared back at me, and my heart sank. I blinked, and the reflection was gone. The driver was back in place, his face blank, his eyes fixed ahead. But the discomfort remained. The whispers continued, now almost a constant murmur, too loud to ignore. And as I glanced down at the seat beside me, I saw something that froze me in place, a note, folded neatly on the seat, as if it had always been there. I didn't remember seeing it when I sat down, but there it was, waiting for me. My fingers shook as I reached for it. and I unfolded it slowly, each movement deliberate, as if I were walking through a nightmare and every action had consequences. The note simply read, "You shouldn't have taken the late bus." A jolt of panic shot through me, my breath caught in my chest. I wanted to scream, to shout at the driver, at the passengers, to make sense of what was happening, but my voice was lost, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere inside the bus. I clutched the note in my hand, feeling the paper crinkle between my fingers. And as I looked around, I saw that the passengers' lips were moving again. But now, the whispers weren't about me. They were about the bus itself. "He's been driving this route for years," one voice murmured. "Every passenger's secret has to be heard." "They never leave," another added, low and dark. "They always come back." The words made my stomach churn, and I pressed my face to the cold window, desperate for a glimpse of something familiar. The city outside was a blur, the lights distorted by the rain. The world seemed to be melting, everything turning into shadows and fleeting shapes. The bus felt like a tunnel, a passage I couldn't escape, winding deeper into something I didn't understand. I could feel the weight of the whispers pressing down on me, smothering me. The closer we got to my stop, the more the voices seemed to close in, filling the space until I could barely breathe. I had to get off. The bus pulled to a stop, the doors opening with a faint hiss. I hesitated, unsure of whether it was safe to leave, but something inside me urged me to step off the bus, to step away from the strange energy that had surrounded me for the entire ride. I rose from my seat, my legs unsteady as I moved toward the door, still clutching the note. As I stepped off the bus, I turned for a moment to glance back inside. The lights inside flickered, casting a dim, eerie glow on the empty seats. The doors shut behind me, and the bus pulled away, leaving me standing in the rain. For a moment, I stood there, uncertain, lost. But as I turned to walk away, I heard the faintest whisper, one last secret, slipping through the cracks. "You'll be back," it said. I didn't turn back. I couldn't. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, it was true, and that the late bus would be waiting for me again.